The bells tolled at dusk, not in celebration, not in mourning, but with the solemn weight of something buried and unwilling to rest. Their bronze throats cried out across St. Louis, carrying through the narrow streets and over the river fog. Yet when the final peal faded into the darkening air, no hymn rose to answer it. No voices filled the chapel, no chorus swelled. Only silence, thick, unnatural, a silence that pressed itself against the lungs of those who dared enter. The townsfolk would later whisper that it was not silence at all, but the chapel itself, holding its breath. Inside, the air smelled of old stone and wax drippings that never quite hardened. The pews worn by generations of kneeling bodies seemed abandoned by devotion. Candle flames shivered without breeze, as though recoiling from something unseen. In the rafters high above, a murder of crows had gathered, their black eyes catching the dying light through the stained glass. They did not move, they did not caw. They only stared downward at the altar, as if waiting for a prayer that would not come. The priest, Father Mallory, stood at the pulpit, his mouth open as though to speak, but no sound emerged. His lips trembled, forming the first syllable of the Gloria Patri, yet his voice was swallowed whole before it left his throat. He clutched his chest, looked out at the few parishioners who had braved evening mass, and in their eyes he saw the same terror reflected. That sound itself had abandoned them. An old woman in the front row crossed herself violently, whispering, through broken teeth, "Not again, not again." Her voice fell into the hush like a stone dropped into a well, vanishing as though the walls themselves had consumed it. At the far corner, Sister Catherine gripped the rosary until her knuckles went white. Her lips moved soundlessly, prayers devoured before they reached heaven. Sister Agnes and Sister Miriam, seated beside her, exchanged glances thick with dread. For they knew the decree. The Church had forbidden their speech, branding their voices dangerous, heretical, a curse upon the faithful. And yet here, in the silence that devoured all tongues, it seemed as if the chapel itself obeyed that command, striking mute not only the sisters, but everyone within its shadow. The wooden beams groaned. The floor trembled faintly under the weight of something not human. From the back of the chapel a boy cried out, but his wail warped, thinning into nothing before it could echo. His mother clutched him to her chest, rocking in frantic silence, tears spilling unchecked. Some swore later that the walls themselves shuddered, as though the stone was alive, sucking in every sound, every prayer, every breath, and keeping it for its own. The more devout crossed themselves in panic, while others stumbled for the door, their footsteps muffled into a dull, unnatural thud. Then came the whisper. It was faint, trembling, barely a ripple against the suffocating quiet. Not heard with ears, but felt in the marrow. "Confess," it said. "Confess before the hour tolls again." Father Mallory dropped the Bible from his trembling hands. It hit the stone floor with no sound, though the shock rattled the pews. His mouth moved, desperate, but no voice came. Only his hollow, panicked gasps, devoured before they could live. The sisters closed their eyes, their faces stricken. Sister Catherine shook her head violently, as though denying an order only she could hear. Sister Agnes clasped her crucifix, so tightly that blood ran between her fingers, though the drops fell without sound, dark and heavy, vanishing into the shadows at their feet. The whisper returned, louder now, crawling beneath the skin. Confess what was sung. Confess what should not have been heard. The air thickened, pressing on the chest like an unseen hand. The crows in the rafters shifted at last, spreading their wings, a black rustle that filled the silence not with noise, but with dread. They did not cry out, they did not flee. They merely stretched, as if preparing for flight when the final note was struck. The bells tolled once more. The sound was not carried through air, but through bone, reverberating inside the skull of every soul in the chapel. Faces contorted in silent cries, mouths gaping, throats convulsing, yet still no sound escaped. The toll was not heard with ears, but lived through flesh, as though the bell were inside them. Sister Miriam fell to her knees, her rosary scattering beads across the floor. They rolled into the cracks between the stones, vanishing as though the earth itself drank them in. She mouthed a single word again and again, "Mercy, mercy, mercy," but her plea was smothered. A fissure cracked across the altar stone, hair thin, but bleeding. Dark liquid seeped out, red as fresh blood, running downward into the grooves of the marble floor. The crows leaned forward, their black beaks glinting, their eyes reflecting the crimson stain. Father Mallory staggered backward, striking the crucifix on the wall. Christ's wooden face tilted down, mouth open, as if gasping along with them all. His carved eyes seemed wet in the candlelight. The whisper rose again, no longer faint but deafening without sound. It surged through marrow, through dreams, through memory. The silence is not empty. The silence is full. The bells tolled again, their unseen hammer striking. The sound crashed through ribs and skulls, tearing tears from eyes, breaking bodies into convulsions. And then, from the mouths of the three forbidden sisters, burst the first true sound of the night. Not hymn, not prayer, not words at all. A scream, sharp and endless, tearing from their throats with such force that the rafters quaked, and the crows took wing in a storm of black feathers. It was the scream of something unhuman wearing human form. It clawed at the walls, rattled the stained glass, and shattered the silence into 1,000 bleeding shards. But when the parishioners turned to flee, the doors of the chapel slammed shut, their hinges groaning like coffins nailed in the earth. The scream went on, and the bells tolled once more. The booth stood like a coffin in the corner of the chapel, its wood swollen with damp, its hinges blackened with age, its door nailed shut with iron that seemed to rust faster than the rest of the church. Yet the air around it never settled. It pulsed faintly, as if the booth itself drew breath, inhaling the prayers of those who dared glance its way. Incense bled steadily from its cracks, grey coils that hung too long, refusing to disperse, clinging to the rafters like spirits reluctant. To ascend, the parishioners would not sit near it. Some crossed themselves as they passed. Some spat quietly on the stone to ward away evil. Children were warned not to look too long, lest their reflection linger in the varnished wood after they had turned away. The confessional had been sealed for 30 years, since the night of screams, since the sisters' decree, since Father Mallory's hands shook too violently to lift the hammer that locked it forever. Yet it still wept. At dusk, when the bells finished tolling and silence spread, like a disease across the chapel, faint sobbing bled from within the booth. It was never sharp, never pleading, but slow, steady, like a child grieving something it could not name. The sound was wrong, muffled but distinct, as if heard through the floorboards of a dream. Many parishioners swore it did not reach their ears, but rather their ribs, trembling there as though their own bones were weeping. "Father," a whisper once pressed itself against the walls, not a shout, not even a voice raised, just the fragile plea of someone too weary to be heard. Father Mallory's jaw had locked tight. He had turned his face to the altar and refused to look toward the corner again. The old woman who always sat closest to the booth, though never within arm's reach, claimed she once saw the incense glow red at its heart, as if the smoke were embers rising from a hidden fire. She spoke of shadows curling beneath the door, stretching across the stone like black hands. "It listens still," she muttered, her voice shaking with the weight of secret knowledge. "It listens, though none should speak." On the 7th, night after the silence first swallowed the chapel, 2 boys dared each other to press their ears to the booth. Their laughter echoed in the nave, thin and nervous, and they shoved each other forward until the younger one leaned against the nailed wood. His cheek pressed to it, his ear strained. He heard a breath, slow, drawn out, damp, as if water filled the lungs that took it, and then the breath stopped. A voice rasped against the wood, so close it should have warmed the boy's ear. "Tell me, what did you hear in the silence?" The boy tore himself back with a scream that made no sound, his throat moving wildly, but his voice smothered into nothing by the chapel's cursed hush. His friend dragged him away by the sleeve, and neither ever spoke of it again. The boy grew, pale and thin in the weeks that followed, refusing food, shivering even in the summer heat, eyes fixed always on that corner, as if someone behind the wood still waited for his answer. The priests, bound by Rome's decree, never touched the booth again. Their orders were clear: it must remain sealed. No confession within, no penance offered, no absolution given. They sprinkled holy water on the nails each morning. though it steamed faintly against the iron as though striking hot metal. At night, they locked the chapel doors tighter than the coffin itself, for fear that something inside would whisper, loud enough to be heard across the city. But still the incense bled, still the booth wept, still the weeping turned, sometimes, into something else. Once, Sister Catherine swore she heard laughter inside, low, strangled, as though someone were drowning but refusing to die. She clutched her rosary until the beads cut into her palms. "It remembers us," she whispered to Agnes and Miriam, her lips barely daring to shape the words. "It remembers our voices, and it mocks them." Agnes refused to look at her. Miriam closed her eyes and mouthed silent prayers. But the booth, that coffin of wood and iron, seemed to creak in reply as if shifting on its base. The crows had taken to roosting above it, their claws scratching at the beams until wood dust fell like ash. They stared down at the booth in perfect stillness, their feathers slick with candlelight, their beaks opening and closing without sound, as though repeating whatever confessions were muttered within. On the 12th night, the incense smoke changed. It thickened, darkened, no longer grey but black as char, writhing like serpents against the ceiling. It did not smell of herbs or sanctity, but of scorched flesh and wet earth. The parishioners fled that night, crossing themselves in terror, leaving the chapel empty save for the 3 silent sisters and Father Mallory, who clutched the crucifix as if to break it from the wall. And then, when the last candle sputtered, the nails in the confessional groaned, the wood flexed as though something inside pressed outward. The incense spilled faster, curling along the floor like smoke from an open grave. Beneath the nailed door came the sound of fingernails dragging across the inside panel, slow and deliberate, carving lines into the wood that should not move but did. "Father," the whisper returned, this time sharper, closer, vibrating through the very marrow of those who remained. "Father, I am not finished. You must hear the rest." Father Mallory's face drained white. His lips trembled, and though no voice would come, his body spoke his terror. He backed toward the altar, his crucifix shaking in his hands. The sisters did not move, their eyes fixed on the booth, wide and glistening, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The incense flared, red again. The wood split, and for the first time in 30 years a single sound escaped the confessional. Not words, not laughter, not prayer, a scream, long, ragged, endless, not from one voice but from many, layered upon each other like 1,000 mouths. Crying in the same breath, it rattled the stained glass, it shook the stone, it pressed every candle flat, smothering their flames, and when the scream fell away, leaving only the stench of smoke and blood, the door of the booth trembled. One nail had loosened. The hymnals lay mutilated, their leather covers curled and brittle, their pages ripped with a violence that suggested not mere hands, but something sharper, hungrier. The torn leaves bore scorch marks that had not touched the wood beneath them, as though the fire came not from flame, but from the words themselves fleeing their captivity. In the flickering candlelight, the absences trembled, the blank spaces where verses once lived seeming to breathe faintly, as though they ached to return. The parishioners whispered that it began on a Sunday morning, when a girl with hair like ash opened her hymnal and found only blankness staring back at her. She had traced her finger down the page in terror, lips moving without sound, her eyes wide as if she still saw the words though no one else could. Then the book had hissed, like coals pressed under water, and its edges blackened beneath her trembling hand. After that no hymnal was trusted. The psalms most beloved, those sung for centuries in sorrow and devotion, were gone. Some vanished cleanly, as if they had never existed. Others left behind only burned fragments of phrases. "Deliver us." From the silence, in the shadow of, Father Mallory ordered the books collected, locked, burned if necessary. But the sisters, forbidden to speak, clutched their hymnals with pale fingers as though they carried more than paper. When the priests pried them away, Catherine's face twisted with a voiceless protest. Agnes fell weeping, though no sound left her throat, and Miriam clutched her rosary until blood ran again from her palms. That night, the air in the chapel thickened. Candlelight bent strangely, pulling long shadows across the pews. The hymnals stacked in the sacristy began to flutter, though no breeze passed, their scorched edges curling inward, as if turning pages no one touched. Then came the whispers, soft, insidious, threading between the timbers, climbing down the stained glass, lingering in the rafters. Words without breath, syllables without tongue. Verses sung not by voices, but by absence itself. The congregation froze, straining to hear. What they caught was broken, disjointed, yet drenched in sorrow. Deliver us, Mark, from the silence, where wings darken, where light cannot follow. An old man near the back wept into his hands, though he did not know why. A child laughed, nervously, only to choke as though something unseen clutched his throat. The sisters stood rigid, their eyes glassy, as if the whispers pulled them nearer to memory, to something they once dared sing aloud. It was said that long ago, before the decree, before the sealing of the confessional, the sisters had found an old psalter buried beneath the chapel stones. Not written in Latin, not in any tongue known to priests, but in curling characters that shimmered faintly under candlelight. The notes, when sung, were unlike hymns of man, low, unearthly, too wide for mortal lungs. And yet they had sung. And yet the church had silenced them. But the words were not gone. They were returning, syllable by syllable, crawling back into the world through charred paper and empty space. One night, when the moon hung like a corpse-pale wafer over the steeple, the hymnals opened themselves. Without hands, without motion save for the creak of old leather, they spread wide upon the pews. Pages flipped violently, stopping on the scorched sections. And in those blackened absences, faint letters began to bleed through. Not ink, not charcoal, something darker, wet, alive. The words wrote themselves in blood that was not blood, staining the whiteness until every torn psalm returned, writhing on the page like worms in a grave. Sister Catherine was the first to notice. She leaned over the book, her lips parting, though she dared not make a sound. Her eyes glistened as though she recognized the text, though no one else did. The letters seemed to breathe, to shift, refusing to settle into form. But still, the sisters read them, their faces stricken, reverent, fearful. "Do not read." Father Mallory croaked, his voice trembling, the first sound he had dared since the silence. Do not read what was forbidden. But his warning came too late. The pages turned again violently, as if a storm had ripped through the nave. Candles guttered. The whispers swelled into a chorus, many voices overlapping, crying in tones both sweet and venomous. "We are not gone. We were sung once. We shall be sung again." The hymnals shook. Their bindings snapped, pages tearing free, rising into the air like a storm of ash. Each burned leaf circled above the congregation, their edges glowing faintly red, casting sparks that fell like fireflies. Parishioners ducked, praying, shielding their children, but the sisters lifted their faces as though in worship, their mouths straining against silence, desperate to join the phantom choir. Then, without warning, the pages collapsed to the floor, in a single breath, leaving only one hymnal open on the altar. Its pages burned from within, though no flame was seen. Words glowed, shifting, twisting, until one phrase alone remained legible. "The hollow choir shall rise." The letters bled, then melted into blackness. The smell of scorched flesh filled the chapel. The walls quivered faintly at first, then stronger, like lungs drawing breath after drowning. The rafters groaned as if bending beneath invisible weight, and in the silence that followed, a single sound returned, the faintest note of song, carried not by human throat, but by stone itself. It was long, low, impossibly deep, resonating from beneath the floorboards. Dust trickled from the beams, the pews trembled. Parishioners clutched each other, too terrified to flee, too entranced to move. The sisters' eyes rolled upward, white, their lips twitching soundlessly to match the note. Their rosaries clattered to the floor. Their hands rose as though conducting a choir only they could see, and as the sound swelled, cracking the very mortar between the stones, the crucifix above the altar began to hum, Christ's carved mouth splitting wider, as though to join in the song. They walked as though under sentence, their veils trailing the cold stones, their silence not of discipline but of dread. The three sisters, Catherine, Agnes, Miriam, moved in a line along the cloister hall, eyes cast down, lips locked as if an unseen needle had pierced them shut. They passed beneath the arches at dusk, when the last light strained through stained glass and bled across the flagstones like spilled wine. It was then the shadows betrayed them, their forms stretched far, too long, reaching not westward toward the dying sun but curling inward toward the nave, bending against the logic of light. The shadows twisted as though in pain, their limbs distended, their faces lengthened into masks that did not match the sisters' bowed heads. In the flicker of the torches, the darkness seemed to mouth words the sisters no longer could. The townsfolk, who glimpsed them in the cloister, whispered of those shadows as if they were alive. A boy once pointed, claiming he saw Sister Agnes's shadow break away for a heartbeat, dragging itself across the stones before snapping back to her feet. His mother struck him across the mouth for speaking it, but the fear in her eyes betrayed belief. The priests averted their gaze whenever the sisters walked. They had been commanded by Rome, observe, contain, but never confront. Yet how could they not see the unnatural length of those silhouettes, blackened tendrils curling around the pillars, reaching toward the altar as though desperate to touch consecrated ground? At night, when the sisters retired to their cells, the candles guttered low. Father Mallory once walked past their quarters and swore he heard footsteps pacing, though the nuns were known to kneel in prayer until dawn. When he dared glance beneath the crack of a door, the light of his taper revealed two shadows, where only one figure knelt. He staggered back, muttering, "Not yours. Not yours at all." It was Catherine who carried the heaviest burden. Her eyes, though lowered, burned with unshed words. Often her shadow writhed most violently, its head cocking upward when hers remained bowed, its hands twitching toward her throat as though desperate to unseal her silence. Once, in the courtyard, when moonlight made the world silver and strange, her shadow opened its mouth wide, black against the pale flagstones, though her lips never parted. From that gaping darkness issued a shape, fleeting and grotesque, a flock of wings beating noiselessly before vanishing into the night. Agnes's shadow grew longer each week, so long it reached across thresholds she never crossed. Once, a novice found it pooled in the vestry, while Agnes herself prayed in the chapel. He froze, watching as the shadow's hands traced the shelves of relics with longing. When Agnes rose moments later and entered, her shadow snapped back to her feet like a leash pulled taut, and the novice fled the convent the next morning, never to return. Miriam's shadow was quieter, subtler, but cruel. It lingered at the foot of sickbeds, bending close to the faces of the dying. The infirm whispered of a black figure that smiled as their breaths grew shallow, a nun without features, whose veil brushed their skin. The sisters said nothing when confronted, but Miriam's hands trembled for days after, as if touched by frost. "They are not alone," the old woman in the pews murmured, her eyes red with sleepless nights. "They walk with others. The others wear their skin in black." The whispers spread through St. Louis like plague. Some said the sisters had bargained with something in the sealed confessional, that their silence was the price, but the shadows were the debt collectors. Others claimed the forbidden psalms had filled their shapes with echoes of lost souls. Still others swore that no earthly explanation sufficed, that the shadows were not merely extensions, but parasites, growing fat. Upon the sisters' withheld screams, the truth revealed itself slowly, cruelly, in the way all cursed things do. One evening, as the bells tolled vespers, the sisters walked in their line through the cloister. The last light of day painted the walls in blood red. Their shadows elongated until they touched the opposite side of the hall. Catherine stumbled, her veil slipping. The shadows convulsed. A gasp, voiceless yet felt, swept the cloister. For a heartbeat, the three shadows no longer mirrored the women at all. Catherine's shadow turned its head toward Agnes. Agnes's shadow reached a hand toward Miriam, and Miriam's shadow raised its arms skyward, fingers bending backward at unnatural angles. The sisters froze, bound by terror, their bodies trembling though their lips did not part. The torchlight flickered once, and their shadows snapped back into place. But the watching novices swore the shadows lingered a second longer, smiling with mouths full of teeth. That night, Father Mallory bolted the chapel doors and paced before the altar, whispering prayers with raw lips. They are splitting, the bodies and the shades. One will not hold the other long. His voice shook. He stared toward the cloister door, as if expecting the sisters to arrive unbidden. When they separate, when the shadows walk free, may God hold us. The crows stirred in the rafters above, feathers raining down like black snow. They, too, seemed to sense the rift widening, their heads cocked toward the cloister, beaks clicking in uneasy rhythm. And at midnight, the first scream split the silence, not from a throat, but from the floor itself. It tore through the flagstones like a fault line, rumbling up from beneath the convent. The sisters rose from their beds, mouths still sealed, but their shadows erupted across the walls, thrashing violently, clawing the plaster, writhing as though trying to peel themselves away entirely. The candles snuffed out one by one, and when the last light died, the shadows kept moving. At dawn, the chapel smelled not of incense but of iron, sharp and raw, as though a butcher's block had been laid across the altar. The parishioner who first entered fell to her knees at the sight. A red stain spread across the white stone slab, glistening in the morning light, slick as if drawn fresh from a wound. Yet no cut marred the marble, no source dripped above. The stone itself seemed to bleed. Father Mallory was summoned. His face paled when he beheld it, though he forced his hands steady as he fetched cloth and holy water. He scrubbed until his knuckles cracked, muttering scripture under his breath. The stain smeared, thinned, but never faded entirely. When he finished, the altar glistened wet, and the scent of iron still clung to the air. "Not blood," he whispered, though his voice quavered. Not blood, but a sign. By nightfall the red had returned, darker, richer, as though it had sunk deeper into the marrow of the stone. This time it spread into the carved channels of the altar, filling them like veins. In the candlelight, it seemed to pulse faintly, keeping time with the tolling of the chapel bell. The sisters saw it and lowered their eyes, lips sealed, yet their shadows leaned forward eagerly, stretching across the floor toward the altar as though thirsting for the crimson sheen. Agnes's hands trembled against her rosary, beads clicking soundlessly as her shadow's fingers dipped into the stain. Catherine squeezed her eyes shut. Miriam turned her face away, but her shadow lingered longest, tracing the bleeding stone with something like devotion. Whispers spread quickly through St. Louis. The altar weeps. The altar bleeds. The Mass is fed by more than bread and wine. Some claimed the stain was a miracle, a sign that Christ himself bled anew for their sins. Pilgrims flocked to see it, falling to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the cold stone until their skin came away damp. A mother rubbed the crimson, moisture across her child's chest to cure a cough. An old soldier dabbed it onto scars that still burned from war. But the priests forbade such acts, striking the desperate hands away, for they saw not grace in the blood, but a curse. Mallory decreed the altar would be cleansed each morning and sealed with linen by night. Still, the stain grew, deeper each dawn, darker each dusk. By the third night it pooled across the floor, gathering in the grooves of the stone as though the chapel itself had been gutted. The novices whispered that the stain shifted when no one looked directly upon it. Some swore it formed shapes, faces half-formed, mouths open wide in endless screams. One claimed to see a nun's veil reflected in the blood. Another fainted when the stain rippled outward, as if something beneath the stone had stirred. On the seventh day, the old woman who never left the pews approached the altar. Her hands shook violently as she reached out. The priests shouted for her to stop, but her fingers touched the blood. She raised them to her lips, tasting. Her eyes rolled, back white. Her mouth opened wide, and though no sound could pass the chapel's walls, her lips mouthed a phrase all could see it remembers. She collapsed to the floor, lifeless, crimson staining her chin. When the priests dragged her body away, the stone pulsed again, darker, heavier, as if fed by her final breath. That night, Father Mallory locked himself in the sacristy. His prayers grew frantic, tumbling into broken Latin, half groans, half supplications. He flung salt across the threshold, doused the altar in holy water until the floor flooded, but the water itself curdled red, thickening as it touched the stain. He struck the stone with his crucifix, but the wood snapped in his hands. The sisters watched from the cloister arch, their shadows swaying unnaturally on the wall behind them, as though laughing silently. Catherine pressed her hands to her lips, straining to hold in words desperate to burst free. Agnes fell to her knees, tears streaming. Miriam turned her eyes to the rafters, where crows circled endlessly, feathers drifting like ash. And then, as the midnight bell tolled, the altar stone split. A jagged crack tore across its surface, wide and gaping. From the wound poured not blood alone, but a torrent thick and black, reeking of decay, steaming in the cold air. It spilled across the marble floor, filling the grooves, running down the steps like a river of gore. Parishioners fled in terror, slipping in the crimson flood. But the sisters did not move. Their shadows waded into the blood eagerly, drinking deep. And in the reflection of that black water, something stirred. Faces, countless faces, pressed against the surface from beneath. Eyes wide, mouths screaming soundlessly, trapped in the stone, in the river, in the blood itself. They beat against it as though the altar had been their tomb, and now their prison cracked open. Father Mallory fell to his knees, clutching what remained of the crucifix, his lips trembling as he mouthed a final prayer. And then the blood rose, climbing the altar steps, defying gravity, seeping back into the crack from which it came. The stone pulsed once more, and in the silence that followed, the shape of a hand pressed up from within the marble, thin, skeletal, wet. It dragged once, against the stone, leaving a trail of red. It began as a faint disturbance. A tremor felt more in bone than ear, as though the chapel itself exhaled from beneath its stone ribs. At first, the parishioners dismissed it as the shifting of old foundations, the sigh of ancient earth. But then came the footsteps, measured, deliberate, dragging across the floor when no one moved. They echoed hollow and distant, like soldiers on parade beneath a buried vault. Father Mallory stood rigid during Mass, his hands clenched white around the chalice as the sound passed beneath him. Each step seemed to rise through his soles, thudding, in his chest, so that he feared his heart would beat in time with the unseen march. When he dared glance at the congregation, he saw their faces pale, their heads turning toward the floor as if listening to ghosts. And then came the voices. They rose not in one tongue but many, Latin unraveling into Greek, Greek dissolving into something older, sharper, more serpentine. The voices did not cry out in unison but overlapped, a chorus of pleading, some sobbing for mercy, others commanding in tones too stern for mortal throats. Yet all were muffled, as though the stone pressed a heavy hand upon their mouths. A novice once leaned close to the floor in the chapel's center, ear against the tile, trembling. He swore he heard his own name called from the darkness below, spoken in his mother's voice, though she had been dead 5 winters. When he lifted his head, his hair had turned white at the temples. He left the convent the next morning, without farewell. The sisters walked the cloister with lowered eyes, but their shadows betrayed them. Catherine's shadow leaned close to the floor, ear bent in imitation of the novice, though her body walked upright. Agnes's shadow scratched at the tiles with fingers too long, too sharp, leaving faint grooves in the stone. Miriam's shadow lay prone upon the floor, its mouth pressed wide against the cracks as if drinking the voices that seeped upward. At night, the sound deepened. The footsteps turned frantic, pacing, running, colliding. The muffled voices grew frantic too, their cries rising like those of prisoners clawing at locked doors. The floor trembled so fiercely that dust sifted down from the rafters. Parishioners lay awake in their beds, swearing they felt the vibrations echo through their bones, as if they themselves were coffins rattled by restless dead. "They are beneath us," the old woman croaked, rocking in the front pew, her eyes wide with sleepless terror. "Not resting, not buried. Buried things are still, these are not still, they walk." Father Mallory ordered lanterns brought. The priests pried up a tile near the altar, hoping to reveal only earth, only stone. But beneath the slab yawned a hollow dark, air rushing upward as though the chapel had been choking. A staircase descended, swallowed by shadow, its steps slick with moisture, worn smooth by feet long gone. The priests hesitated. None dared descend. They replaced the tile, with shaking hands, sealing the mouth again with wax and salt. But the sounds only grew louder, angrier, as though the things below resented the interruption. The next evening, as the bells tolled, a new sound joined the chorus. Not footsteps, not voices, a knocking, 3 slow raps, always 3, always beneath. The altar. Father Mallory tried to continue the mass, his words trembling, his hands spilling wine across the cloth. But each time he raised the host, the knocks resounded again, shaking the chalice, rattling the candelabra. By the final prayer, he was weeping openly, his voice breaking as he whispered, Who calls from under the house of God?" The silence answered only with another knock. 3 times. The sisters turned as one, their veils swaying, their shadows bowing toward the altar, as if greeting an old friend. That night, the voices grew clearer, closer. Parishioners lying in their homes heard them not in the chapel, but beneath, their own floors rising through the wood, whispering beneath their beds. Children cried that pale hands reached upward through the cracks, grasping their blankets before retreating. Farmers swore their livestock bleated in terror at nothing, hooves striking frantically at unseen pursuers. The crows clustered thick on the chapel roof, claws scraping against the tiles, their eyes fixed downward. They did not caw, they only listened. On the 13th night, the floor cracked. It began with a groan that shook the pews. A fissure split down the center of the nave, narrow but deep, bleeding dust and the stench of rot. From its depth rose not air but a low hum, a note that vibrated the ribs of all present. The parishioners clutched their chests, choking, gasping, unable to match their breath against the sound. Then came the voices again, but no longer muffled. They surged upward, free, countless throats crying as one. Their words were tangled, broken, unholy, yet threaded with a single phrase repeated again and again, louder until it rattled the stained glass. "Let us in." The fissure widened. The tiles buckled, splitting like brittle bone. And beneath the altar something vast shifted, pressing upward against the stone as if testing the strength of its prison. A hand, thin, grey, too long, emerged briefly, clawing, the crack before vanishing again. The priests fell to their knees, choking on prayers. The parishioners fled, trampling one another. The sisters did not move. Their shadows poured into the widening fissure eagerly, stretching downward as though called home. And from the depths came not knocking now, but pounding, fists hammering, against the underside of the chapel, shaking the stones, tolling like a second bell. It began at twilight, when the horizon still burned faintly, yet the streets of St. Louis fell colder than the grave. The people heard it before they saw it. A hum, low and droning, neither song nor prayer, but something in between, as though the earth itself murmured in mourning. The sound crawled through shutters, seeped beneath doors, rattled glass in their frames. Men set down their cups mid-drink. Children pressed small hands against their ears. Old women muttered, "The procession walks." And then from the mouth of the crooked lane they appeared. A row of women clothed in black veils, faces shrouded, hands clasped, their steps perfectly in rhythm though no drumbeat guided them. They carried no candles, no cross, no coffin. Yet the hush that followed in their wake was heavier than any bier. The townsfolk pressed themselves against the walls, eyes averted, breaths held. No one dared ask whose death was being honored, for the air around the women smelled not of lilies or incense, but of damp earth freshly overturned. The humming deepened as they passed. It was a sound that pressed against the ribs, rattling them like hollow wood. Though their lips never moved beneath their veils, the music swelled as if the stones themselves sang. One man, drunk or too bold, whispered, "Where is the coffin?" His voice carried farther than he intended, striking the silence like a stone against glass. At once the veiled heads turned, not fully, not naturally. Their necks bent too far, too smoothly, until their faces pointed toward him beneath the cloth. Their humming ceased. The man staggered back, crossing himself, mumbling apology. The procession did not answer. Their heads turned forward again as though nothing had been interrupted. but the air behind them remained thick, colder, as if their notice lingered. The priest, watching from the church steps, whispered, "No coffin, no corpse, only mourning. They walk for what has not yet died." The townsfolk whispered of curses carried in their wake. Milk soured, dogs wailed, and would not be silenced. Windows filmed with condensation, though no rain had fallen. One girl swore the procession's shadows moved differently from their bodies, stretching longer, reaching out, dragging something invisible between them. As the women turned the corner of the square, a boy too young to fear called out, "Whose funeral is it?" The humming stopped again, and this time one voice answered. Not spoken, but breathed, sibilant, sliding into the marrow of all who heard. "Yours," the boy's mother screamed, dragging him into her skirts. But when the people looked, the veiled women had already turned away, their humming resuming as if uninterrupted. Yet the boy's lips trembled with frost. His breath smoked, though the night was warm. No one left their homes after that. The streets emptied, shutters locked tight, yet still the procession walked. Night after night their black veils floated past, their steps light, their song low. Each evening, a new voice joined the hum, sometimes weak, sometimes strong, but always one more than the night before. Some claimed to see faint outlines moving between the women, empty spaces shaped like human forms, swaying, weightless, as though pallbearers carried what the eye refused to name. Others whispered they saw faces pressing faintly through the veils, not the women's own but strangers, drowned men, starved children, soldiers who never returned from war. By the seventh night the town was sick with dread. Doors were barred with salt, crosses carved above every lintel. Yet still the humming came, winding through the alleys like smoke, heavy, suffocating. A merchant's wife, too curious for her own soul, lifted her shutter just a finger's breadth to see them pass. What she saw froze her blood. The veiled women did not walk upon the cobblestones. Their feet hung inches above the ground, drifting forward as if drawn by invisible strings. Beneath them, the cobbles darkened with damp patches that spread like stains of water, or blood. She swore she saw the stones sag, as though the earth beneath was hollow, hungry, waiting. On the ninth night, the bells tolled without hands to ring. Them. The procession halted before the church steps, their humming louder now, almost jubilant. The priest, trembling, raised his hand in blessing, but the words withered in his throat. For as he gazed at the black veils, he saw beneath them not faces, not flesh, but empty hollows, mouths that opened too wide, humming with voices not their own. The priest fainted where he stood. The procession moved past him, filing into the church, though no door was opened. One by one they slipped through the wooden doors as though the wood were smoke, and when the last of them passed, the church groaned. Its windows wept condensation. The crucifix above the altar cracked, splintering down the middle as if under unseen weight. The townsfolk who dared listen swore they heard singing from within the locked church that night. Not a hymn, not prayer, but the same hollow drone, filling the rafters until the very walls seemed to bend inward. And when dawn came, the church was empty. No priest, no parishioner, no veiled women. Only silence, and the faintest trail of damp footprints leading down the nave across the altar, toward the floor where the crack still waited to open. The procession had not ended. It had only entered. It began always at midnight, precise as the tolling of the iron bell. An hour when the night was deepest, when even the owls stilled their wings, when the air seemed to hold its breath. The first sound was never a word, never a prayer, only a shriek sharp and long, ripping through the convent walls like a blade through cloth. It pierced the silence so violently that candles guttered and died, and sleepers bolted upright, clutching their throats as though the cry had sprung from their own lungs. The shriek did not fade, but multiplied, joined by others, high, low, guttural, keening, a cacophony of voices that clawed upward until the very air throbbed with sound. The convent itself seemed to recoil, its rafters trembling, its stones groaning as though burdened by what they carried. The nuns pressed pillows over their ears. Children buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. Even the cattle in the fields staggered and bellowed in terror, eyes rolling white. But still the screaming continued until it swelled past pain into something else. It became laughter, not human laughter, not the kind that warms hearth or heart. This was laughter gutted of joy, laughter torn raw, laughter that circled back into despair until it was indistinguishable from weeping. It echoed in layered tones, as though countless throats strained at once, some gurgling, some howling, others whispering through bloodied teeth. The windows of the convent rattled against their frames, yet not a single pane broke. The sound was not outside but within, trapped as if the cries belonged to the very walls. Some swore they saw faces pressed against the glass, contorted, pale, wide-mouthed apparitions that vanished when looked at directly. Father Mallory, driven near mad by the nightly torment, dared whisper prayers into the storm of sound. But each word he spoke was drowned, swallowed, mocked. The voices repeated his prayer back to him in fractured tones, twisting Paternoster into gibbering echoes that ended in shrieks of laughter. One novice, trembling in her cell, whispered to her companion, "They are screaming to be let out." Her companion, weeping into her hands, whispered back, "No, they are screaming because they are already free." The hours dragged, each minute stretched thin by terror, until at last, just as dawn's first light bled into the sky, the voices ceased, not faded, not weakened, stopped, cut off so suddenly that silence itself seemed unnatural, too sharp, as though the world had been cleaved in half. But silence brought no comfort. The walls were wet. Condensation ran down them in streams, darkening the stones as though the building itself had sweat under strain. In the chapel, the altar cloth was torn. The crucifix leaned askew, its Christ's wooden face split by a crack that seemed almost to smile. The people whispered of curses, of damned souls clawing for release. But one by one they began to notice something stranger still. The screaming no longer stayed within the convent. On the seventh night, the town awoke together to the sound of it echoing across the streets. Windows shook, rafters groaned, and the cries threaded through every alley, every corner, as if the whole town had been swallowed by the convent's curse. Mothers clutched their children, swearing the shrieks came from beneath their very floors. Men gripped their doors, swearing the laughter seeped through the keyholes like smoke. A woman in the marketplace collapsed to her knees, clawing at her ears, shrieking in harmony with the unseen choir, until her throat split raw and bloody. And then the sound shifted again. The voices began to call, not words of prayer, not words of comfort. They called names. The first was whispered through the town square, too soft to be the cry of many, too heavy to be the breath of one. Thomas. A farmer named Thomas fell dead that night, his face frozen mid-scream. The next night, another name, Eleanor. The girl Eleanor vanished from her bed, her sheets damp with blood that led to no door, no window, no street. Each midnight after, the voices claimed another name, and the town grew smaller, hollower, each family stripped of someone until fear left them voiceless. The people begged the priests to stop the curse. The priests begged the bishop, but no holy word seemed strong enough to drown the shrieks. By the 13th night, the convent itself seemed alive with sound. The walls throbbed, like the sides of a beating heart. The floor pulsed beneath bare feet, alive, quivering, hungry. The sisters clutched their rosaries, lips moving in silent prayer, but their shadows betrayed them. Shadows that stretched wide-mouthed across the walls, screaming though their bodies stood silent. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the windows of the convent fogged white, every pane clouded with breath. Behind the glass, faint shapes pressed close, faces twisted, endless, their mouths all wide in the same scream. But none shattered the glass. None escaped. They only pressed closer, closer, until the windows bulged as though something inside wanted out, and in the final instant before the town's courage broke, the laughter returned, rolling, endless, unholy. And yet, beneath it, a new sound grew. Not screams, not laughter, knocking, 3 knocks, from inside the chapel doors. It began not with bells, nor footsteps, nor whispered prayers, only a single note, low and trembling, that seemed to bleed from the very stones of the chapel. The people gathered for Mass froze where they stood. No choir had been summoned, no voices had been prepared, and yet the sound filled the air as though the rafters themselves had learned to sing. It was not a pleasant sound. It was not the voice of angels, nor even the broken hum of the veiled women who had walked the streets. It was a hollow resonance, a moan stretched too thin, vibrating through the walls until plaster dust rained softly down. The note wavered in sorrow so pure it stripped the marrow from bone, so deep it bent the breath from lungs. Some tried to cough to clear their throats, but the air itself clung too heavy, pressing down as if it demanded silence. Then came the second note, higher, sharper, cutting across the first, entwining like a blade with flesh. Together they made a harmony too aching to endure, a song that spoke of graves dug shallow, of mouths sewn shut, of prayers unanswered. Mothers gripped their children's hands until their knuckles bled white. Men bowed their heads, though no. Priest commanded them. The invisible choir had begun. It rose in layered voices, countless, impossible, echoing from corners where no body stood. The sound trembled in the floorboards, quivered in the stained glass, swelled in the rafters. No tongue could name the language, yet each listener felt the meaning bloom raw within their ribs. It was grief, it was despair. It was loss so ancient, so total, it could only belong to the dead. A woman in the front pew gasped, clutching her chest. "It is inside me," she whispered, eyes wide, face pale as linen. "The song is inside my lungs." She coughed, and blood spattered across her sleeve. Another parishioner fell to his knees, choking, clutching his throat as though hands unseen had clamped around it. His lips moved in silent prayer, but no sound emerged, only the choir's song pouring from the space around him, using him as its hollow chamber. Father Mallory staggered toward the altar, clutching the chalice for strength. His voice cracked. As he cried out, "This house is the Lord's, leave this place all of you unbidden." The choir answered, not in words but in sound, an ascending note so high it pierced like glass. Every candle snuffed at once. The stained glass rattled, humming in response until the colored saints warped, their painted mouths bending open as though to sing along. The congregation screamed, but their voices were stolen by the music. Their cries folded into the song, absorbed, transformed, until they too became part of the hollow chorus. One by one they fell silent, their mouths still open, their eyes wide with terror. Yet the choir grew louder, fuller, thicker, as if every silenced breath was devoured, reshaped, returned as music not their own. The children were the last to resist. Their sobs broke through, sharp and human, until even those sounds faltered, replaced by notes too heavy for young throats. Tiny chests heaved, rattling with melodies far too old for them to bear. The priest's hands shook, the chalice spilling red across the stone. He forced words through his teeth. "In nomine..." But his prayer cracked, choked, drowned beneath the weight of song. His voice faltered, snapped, and then, like the others, his lips moved only with the rhythm of the unseen choir. The mass continued. The hollow song rose to its full measure now, every voice, living or dead, woven into its terrible hymn. The walls groaned under the pressure of sound. The crucifix above the altar twisted, Christ's carved mouth warping wide as though to join in the dirge. The air shimmered, visible waves trembling like heat over stone. The song told no story, yet all who heard it knew what it meant. They felt their griefs, their buried losses, ripped raw and pulled into the harmony. Mothers dead in childbirth, fathers lost in war, children taken by fever. The choir swallowed every sorrow and returned it, magnified until the church was drowning in lamentation. And still no one could leave. Feet would not move. Bodies sat rigid, bound by sound itself, as though the hymn pinned them like insects to a board. Those who tried found the air too thick to pass through, the doors trembling shut as though welded by invisible force. Outside, the townsfolk who had not entered pressed close to the chapel, their ears against the wood, their faces pale with horror. For though they could not see, they could hear. The voices of their neighbors, their kin, singing in tones not their own, swelling, breaking, collapsing. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the music stopped. The silence was worse. The parishioners sat frozen in the pews, their mouths still open, their eyes still wide. For a heartbeat, none breathed. None moved, and then from the altar a new sound rose, quiet at first, a faint sob. But it was not a living sob. It came from the crucifix. The wooden Christ wept. Not resin, not sap, but blood ran from its carved eyes, down its cheeks, dripping, onto the altar cloth in steady rhythm. And beneath the sobbing came a new note, deeper, darker, vibrating through the stone. It was not the choir this time. It was something beneath the floor, answering the song, preparing to rise. The doors did not yield easily. They groaned beneath the weight of unseen hands, hinges shrieking like living things torn from bone. Splinters rained with each strike of the crowbar, until at last the wood relented, cracking inward to reveal the chapel's breathless dark. The men who forced entry froze at the threshold. A heatless draught swept out, thick with the stench of rust and incense long curdled. Their lanterns flickered low, reluctant, as though light itself resisted entering. And there, before the altar, the three sisters lay. Their bodies were twisted. Upon the stones, veils torn, habits soaked in sweat and something darker. Their mouths were open too wide, lips cracked and split, jaws locked in eternal scream. Their throats bore no clean wound but ragged rents, as if something had clawed outward from within. Their hands clutched their rosaries so tightly the beads had cut into their flesh, strings snapping, scattering pearls across the floor like teeth. Yet it was not silence that greeted the intruders. The voices had not died with the sisters. They rang still, shrill and unyielding, circling the rafters like a storm of birds. The men clapped their hands to their ears, but the sound pierced flesh and bone alike, worming into marrow. It was screaming without breath, shrieking without end, an echo sustained by something no longer human. One man dropped to his knees, lantern shattering beside him. He wept openly, lips moving though no words could form, until his eyes rolled back and his head struck the stone with a hollow crack. Another staggered forward, shouting over the din, "In Christ's name, rest, rest!" But the voices only answered, louder, mocking, each scream overlapping until words dissolved in madness. Some laughed, some wept, others begged. The rafters trembled as though the beams themselves strained beneath the sound, and still the sisters lay unmoving, their bodies slack, their shadows twitching against the wall as if alive without them. The lantern light stretched those shadows long and crooked, and in their flailing movements one could almost read the shape of hands clawing upward, mouths still screaming though the bodies lay dead. Father Mallory was among the intruders. His face, already hollowed by sleepless nights, seemed carved in stone as he staggered down the nave. Each step dragged as though the stones resisted his weight. He fell to his knees before the sisters, eyes shining with something between grief and terror. "Confess to me," he whispered, his voice breaking, swallowed by the screams. "If your souls linger, confess now and be loosed." For a moment, an instant, the shrieking faltered. The air grew heavier, pressing down like a hand upon the chest. Then, from the rafters, one voice broke through the tumult, clear and sharp. "As glass, we confessed." Mallory's lips trembled. To what? The reply came not from the air, but from the sisters themselves. Their bodies convulsed, their jaws snapped open wider still, bones cracking. From their throats black vapor uncoiled like smoke, twisting upward, shaping itself into mouths that screamed though no lungs fed them. To what we carried, the floor split with a groan, the same fissure that had widened night after night, now tearing itself open beneath the altar. From its depths came a pulse, steady, slow, a heartbeat vast and ancient, shaking the stones. The screams bent in rhythm to it, as though every voice obeyed its pulse. Mallory raised the crucifix, trembling, in his hand. His voice shook but did not break. "In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, depart." The vapor recoiled, swirling, shrieking. The sisters' corpses convulsed violently, their rosaries rattling against stone. For an instant, silence. Threatened. For an instant, the voices seemed ready to collapse into nothing, but then the rafters split. The beams cracked open like ribs, dust and splinters raining down. And from above poured not light but darkness. Thick, writhing, screaming, a storm of mouths without faces, eyes without lids, all converging upon the altar. The sisters' shadows rose to meet them, arms outstretched, welcoming. The men fled, stumbling, trampling one another. Their lanterns crashed and sputtered out, leaving the chapel bathed only in the sick glow of moonlight through the shattered roof. Mallory alone did not flee. He knelt where he was, crucifix raised, his face turned upward in rapture or despair. The voices swelled, screaming, laughing, howling, until all was one terrible roar, and then silence. When the townsfolk returned at dawn, the chapel stood hollow. The sisters' bodies were gone. Father Mallory was gone. Only the cracked crucifix remained, its figure missing, the wood weeping fresh blood that pooled upon the altar stone, and carved into the stone by no human hand were words that none dared speak aloud. "We are not done confessing." From beneath the floor, faint and deliberate, came 3 knocks.